Story number 1. The Cursed Jersey of 1985. I found the jersey in an old thrift store on the outskirts of town, buried under a pile of forgotten sports gear. It was a faded red and white, the number 13 stitched on the back. I picked it up, shaking off the dust, and felt an odd chill run through me. The tag was worn, barely legible, but the name on the back stood out: Carver. I was 17, a high school linebacker dreaming of an NFL career. My old jersey had torn in last week's game, and I needed a new one before Friday's match. The store owner, a frail old man with milky eyes, refused to take my money. He simply shook his head and muttered, "It's already yours. Just don't wear it under the lights." I laughed it off and walked out with my free jersey, eager to test it out. The moment I pulled it over my head, a wave of heat surged through me, like stepping onto a sun-baked field in mid-July. I flexed my arms, feeling stronger, more powerful. My reflexes felt sharper, my steps lighter. Maybe it was the excitement of a new jersey, or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. That Friday night, under the bright stadium lights, I played the best game of my life. I moved faster than ever, dodging tackles like they were in slow motion. I hit harder, ran stronger. It felt as if someone else was guiding me, as if my body knew exactly what to do before I even thought about it. My teammates noticed too. "Damn, Jackson," my best friend Tyler said after the game. "You were a beast out there." I grinned, but deep down I felt uneasy. I had never played like that before, not even in practice. It was as if my body wasn't entirely my own. When I got home, I tossed the jersey onto my chair and collapsed onto my bed, exhausted. That night I had the first dream. I was standing in the middle of an empty football field, the floodlights humming above me. A thick fog rolled in, swallowing the goalposts. A man stood at the 50-yard line, his back turned. He wore the same jersey as mine, number 13, Carver. He turned slowly, his face shadowed, but his eyes burned like dying embers. "You shouldn't be wearing that," he whispered. "It's mine." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. Just a dream, I told myself. Just nerves, but the next day, the bruises appeared. Black and blue marks covered my arms and torso, places I didn't remember getting hit. My mom gasped when she saw them at breakfast. "Did someone jump you after the game?" I shook my head, unable to explain. The next game came, and I wore the jersey again. The moment I stepped onto the field, it was like a switch flipped. I wasn't just playing, I was dominating. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel every vibration of the ground beneath me. But something was wrong. I wasn't controlling my body anymore. I tackled harder, almost too hard. I could see the fear in the other players' eyes. When I slammed into the opposing quarterback, I heard a sickening crack. He didn't get up. The crowd fell silent. The paramedics rushed in. My hands trembled as I backed away. I had hit plenty of players before, but never like that. Never enough to break bones. The coach pulled me aside, his face pale. "What the hell was that, Jackson?" I didn't have an answer. That night, the dream returned. This time Carver was closer. His voice was colder. "You're taking what's mine." I tore the jersey off my chair and shoved it in my closet. I wasn't going to wear it again, but then practice came, and I felt weak, sluggish. My body felt like lead. Without the jersey, I was back to being just an average player. I needed it. I pulled it on for the next game, and the power rushed back. But so did Carver. He wasn't just in my dreams anymore. I saw him in the stands, in the empty locker room mirror standing behind me. His voice was in my head, whispering plays, guiding my movements. I wasn't just playing football, I was his puppet, and I couldn't stop. The breaking point came during the state championship, the final play. The other team's star running back charged towards me. I could have stopped him with a clean tackle, but my body moved on its own, faster than I intended. I hit him low, too hard, twisting his body unnaturally. He crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The silence was deafening. Paramedics rushed the field. Coaches yelled. I stood frozen, staring down at my hands. "You see now?" Carver's voice echoed in my head. "It was never about you." I ripped the jersey off and ran. I ran out of the stadium into the night, my breath ragged. The jersey burned against my skin, searing hot. I drove straight back to the thrift store, but the building was gone. Just an empty lot covered in dead grass. I dug my fingers into my scalp, trying to make sense of it. I didn't go back to football after that. I told my coach I was done. My mom didn't understand. Neither did Tyler. But I knew that jersey wasn't normal. I buried it in the woods behind my house that night, 6 feet deep. I poured gasoline over the dirt and lit a match, watching the flames consume the earth. The next morning, I felt lighter. My body ached, but it was my own again. The bruises faded, the whisper stopped, and for the first time in months, I slept without nightmares. Years later, I drove past the old stadium on a rainy evening. The lights were dim, the bleachers empty. I pulled over, staring at the field where everything had gone wrong. A group of kids played under the dull glow of the floodlights. One of them wore a red and white jersey, number 13. I clenched the steering wheel, my pulse hammering. The kid turned slowly, just enough for me to see the name on the back. Carver. I drove away without looking back. Story number 2, fourth quarter, haunting the ghost of MetLife Stadium. I never believed in ghosts, not until that night in MetLife Stadium. It was my rookie year with the Giants, and I was just a backup kicker, barely making my way onto the roster. We had a late-night practice session, and I was the last one on the field, trying to perfect my accuracy. The stadium, usually deafening on game days, was eerily silent. Just the occasional hum of the floodlights and the distant rustle of the wind sweeping through the empty stands. I lined up for a kick, adjusted my stance, and took a deep breath. As I swung my leg, a sharp whisper cut through the silence. "Miss." My foot struck the ball wrong. It wobbled midair, slicing wide to the left. I froze, my pulse spiking. I turned, expecting to see one of my teammates messing with me, but there was no one. Just rows of empty seats and the towering structure of the stadium looming over me. I shook it off, lined up again. Another deep breath. I kicked. "Miss!" The voice was closer. The ball hooked right. My heart pounded. I spun around, scanning the field. Nothing, but something felt off. The air was heavier, the shadows in the stands deeper than they should have been. I forced myself to ignore it. I wasn't about to get scared off by my own imagination. I retrieved the football and set up one last kick. This time, I didn't hesitate. My foot connected perfectly, sending the ball sailing through the uprights. Relief flooded me until I heard it, clapping, slow, mocking, coming from the stands. I turned sharply, eyes darting toward the source of the sound. There, in the dim glow of the stadium lights, a lone figure sat in the front row, hands resting on his knees. He was wearing an old Giants jersey, faded and tattered, number 32. His head was slightly tilted, and though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt his gaze locked onto me. Every hair on my body stood up. I took a step back. "Hey, who the hell are you?" My voice echoed through the empty stadium. No response. The figure just sat there motionless. I grabbed my water bottle and jogged towards the tunnel. Screw this. I'd tell security someone was in the stadium after hours. But as I reached the edge of the field, a voice, low and guttural, cut through the air. It's not turned. The seat was empty. I left the stadium without telling anyone. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe it was a prank, but that night I barely slept. My mind replayed that moment over and over. The whisper, the clap-in, the empty seat. I told myself I wouldn't let it get to me. But then, the nightmares started. I was back on the field, alone, the floodlights flickering. The stadium was filled with a ghostly crowd. Their faces blurred, their voices an eerie hum. And standing at the 50-yard line was the figure in the number 32 jersey. Only this time, I could see his face, or what was left of it. Half of it was missing, like it had been crushed under something heavy. His jaw hung loose, and his one remaining eye burned into me. He lifted a shattered helmet, his fingers barely holding it together. "It's your turn." I'd wake up drenched in sweat every time. My game started slipping. My kicks, once automatic, started going off course. The coaches noticed. My teammates noticed. "You good, man?" My roommate, Darnell, asked after practice one day. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't look convinced. "Well, get your head straight. We need you Sunday." Sunday, game day. It was a night game, prime time. The stadium was packed, roaring, but as I stepped onto the field for my first attempt, my stomach twisted. The air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't name. I looked into the stands, and my breath caught. Front row, section 105, number 32, staring at me. I swallowed hard and turned back to focus. I lined up, took a breath, and kicked. The ball veered wildly to the right, slamming into the post. The crowd groaned. I cursed under my breath, my hands shaking. The next quarter, another attempt, another miss, and then the fourth quarter tie game. 3 seconds left. We were on the 30-yard line. I had one shot to win it. I stepped onto the field, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could feel him watching me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. He wasn't in the stands anymore. He was on the sideline, right behind my coach. My vision blurred. The air around me grew thick. The crowd noise dulled. I could only hear one thing. Miss. I kicked, and for a brief second I thought I'd made it. The ball sailed straight, cutting through the air. Then it curved, sharp, like an invisible hand had swatted it aside. It hit the post and bounced back onto the field. Game over. We lost. I stood there, frozen. My teammates cursed, patted my back, walked off, but I couldn't move. My eyes locked on the sideline. He was still there, smiling. I quit football that week. Told the coach my head wasn't in it anymore. I packed up and left the city, trying to outrun whatever I had brought upon myself. But even now, years later, I still see him sometimes in my dreams, in the corner of my vision when I pass the stadium on TV. Number 32, still waiting for me to step back on the field. Story number 3, The Play That Killed Me, 1999. It started with a tape. I was cleaning out my dad's old storage unit when I found it, tucked inside a dusty cardboard box labeled 1999A VHS tape with no markings except a small sticker on the side. Last game. I should have ignored it. I should have just tossed it in the pile of junk to be thrown away. But something about it felt personal, like it was meant for me to find. So I took it home, dug out an old player from the attic, and fed the tape inside. The static flickered before settling into grainy footage of a football game. The field was muddy, the stadium lights buzzing with a sickly yellow glow. I squinted at the jerseys. The team in white looked familiar. Then it hit me. That was my team. I leaned forward, my breath caught in my throat. The footage was old, sure, but I remembered that season. 1999, my senior year of high school. I played wide receiver for Northwood High, a small-town team that never made it far but played hard, but I didn't remember this game. The scoreboard showed the fourth quarter, Northwood 17, Riverview 20. Just a few seconds left. The camera panned over the field, and my stomach twisted into knots. I was there. I was on the field. I watched myself line up, my stance familiar, even through the grainy footage. The quarterback called the play. I took off down the field, fast, cutting past the defender. I saw myself leap, arms outstretched, hands wrapping around the ball. Touchdown. The crowd erupted, and then I fell. I didn't get up. The camera zoomed in. I was lying motionless in the end zone. My teammates rushed over, waving for help. The paramedics came. The screen crackled with static, and then the footage cut out. I hit rewind, my heart pounding, played it again. Same result. The touchdown, the fall, the lifeless body in the end zone. But I didn't die in high school. I was here, alive, watching this damn tape in my living room. My hands shook as I ejected the VHS. I needed answers. I called my old coach first, but he didn't pick up. So I drove. Back to my hometown. Back to Northwood High. The school looked smaller than I remembered. The paint on the bleachers peeling. The field worn down by decades of games. I found Coach Roberts in his office, gray-haired and tired-looking, but still the same tough man I remembered. When I told him about the tape, his face drained of color. "Son," he said, voice low, "we never played that game." I felt cold all over. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. The season ended early that year. Snowstorm wiped out the last game. We never played Riverview. I left his office in a daze, the world tilting beneath me. If the game never happened to win, what the hell was on that tape? That night, I checked the recording again, hoping I had imagined it. But it was worse. The footage had changed. The camera wasn't at a distance anymore, it was closer. Too close. Like someone had walked onto the field with the lens pointed right at my face. I watched myself lie there, my eyes half open, my lips moving like I was whispering something. The crowd had vanished. My teammates, gone. Just me and the cameraman. The sound crackled. Faint at first, then clearer. A voice, my voice. "He's coming." The screen cut to black. I couldn't breathe. My hands were numb. I checked the timestamp on the tape. The footage ended at exactly 11:17 p.m. I glanced at the clock on my wall. It was 11:16. A knock sounded at my door. My heart slammed against my ribs. I turned slowly, my breath shallow. Another knock, louder this time. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. But there was no signal. My TV flickered, the screen filled with static. Then for a brief second, the footage returned. Not the game, not the field. My front porch. Someone was standing there, wearing a Riverview jersey, number 88. The same number I saw in the footage, the one who had tackled me before I fell. The knocking turned into pounding. The lights in my house flickered. My breath came in short gasps. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't move. And then, silence. The lights stopped flickering. The knocking ceased. I stood there for what felt like hours before I finally gathered the courage to approach the door. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob, expecting something, anything, to be there. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street was quiet. But on the ground, right in front of my door, was a VHS tape, identical to the first. I picked it up with a shaking hand, staring at the label. This one had a marking. Next game. I didn't bring it inside. I didn't watch it. I took that tape and drove straight to the river, throwing it as far as I could into the black water. I moved out of town the next morning. I left behind my job, my apartment, everything. I don't tell people why I left. I don't tell them about the tape, the game that never happened, the ghost that came knocking. I just know one thing. I never played that game in 1999, but somehow it played me. Story number 4. The Phantom Coach of Lambeau Field. Lambeau Field has always had an energy to it, something electric beyond the roar of the crowd. You feel it in your bones when you step onto that frozen grass. Some say it's just the legacy of the Green Bay Packers, but I know better. There's something else there. Something older. Something waiting. I was a rookie backup quarterback, fresh off the draft, trying to find my place in the league. The veterans barely acknowledged me, and the coaches had little interest in wasting time on a third stringer. I spent more hours on the practice field than anywhere else, running drills long after everyone else had gone home. That's how it started. One night, after an exhausting solo practice, I was packing up when I heard the whistle, a sharp, authoritative tweet that cut through the silence of the empty stadium. I turned, expecting to see one of the coaching staff, but the field was deserted. The locker room entrance was closed, the stadium lights casting long, eerie shadows across the turf. Then another whistle, followed by a voice. Run it again. The voice was deep, commanding, with that old-school coach bark that made your spine straighten on instinct. I turned around fully, searching the dark stands. No one. The wind howled through the rafters, but I knew what I had heard. I should have left right then, but something made me stay. Maybe it was the desperation to prove myself, to be ready in case my number was ever called. Or maybe it was something else. I lined up, imagining the play, and ran through the motions. Footwork, drop back, release. A perfect spiral. The ball hit the net cleanly. As soon as it landed, the whistle blew again. Better. Again. My chest tightened. The air felt heavier. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw him. Standing near the 50-yard line was a man, hands behind his back, wearing an old Packers jacket, the kind you don't see anymore, the kind with the faded G patch on the breast. He was built like an old-school coach, broad shoulders, stiff stance, a presence that demanded respect. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a cap, but I could feel his eyes on me. I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, just nodded at the ball. Again. I should have walked away. I should have run, but I didn't. I lined up and threw another pass. The moment the ball hit the target, I heard him again. Step into it more. I adjusted, ran the drill again, and again. Every time, he gave me corrections, short commands that somehow made my mechanics sharper, my movement cleaner. My arm burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I wanted to impress him, to prove myself. After what felt like hours, I bent over, gasping for air. When I looked up, he was gone. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the strange session. The next day, I told one of the assistant coaches about it. He frowned, looking me over like I was crazy. No one's here that late, except the janitors. Security would have picked up any movement. I let it go. But the next night, I went back, and he was waiting. Over the next few weeks, the sessions became a routine. He pushed me harder than any coach I had ever had. Footwork, reads, accuracy. He drilled me on everything. And I listened. He never told me his name, never spoke about anything outside of football. But I could feel his knowledge, his authority. He knew the game better than anyone I met. And under his guidance, I got better, a lot better. It wasn't long before the coaches noticed. They started giving me more reps in practice, throwing me into tougher drills. My passes were sharper, my confidence higher. The starting quarterback even joked, "Damn, rookie, you selling your soul for that arm?" The thought made my stomach twist. One night, after an especially grueling session, I finally got up the nerve to ask him, "Who are you?" He stood still for a long time. Then he sighed, the kind of heavy, exhausted sigh that seemed to carry decades. "I used to coach here," he said finally. "A long time ago." Something in my chest tightened. "What happened?" He turned his head slightly, just enough that I could finally see part of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray. His eyes were deep-set, hollow, like a man who had spent too many years in the cold. They forgot me. The wind howled through the stadium. I stepped back. The air felt thick, heavy. I suddenly remembered something, an old story I'd read about a coach from the 1960s, a man who had pushed his players so hard in practice that one collapsed, died right there on the field. The team never recovered. He was forced to resign, vanished from the public eye. Some say he never left. I swallowed hard. "You're him." His gaze locked onto mine. "They may have erased me, but I'm still here." My breath turned to ice in my lungs. The stadium lights flickered. The field felt too big, too empty. My legs screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. He took a step forward. "You have one more lesson to learn." I turned and ran. My cleats pounded against the turf, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the stadium shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. I didn't sleep that night, didn't go back the next, or the one after that. I started missing throws in practice. My confidence wavered. It was like something had been taken from me, something I had no right to have in the first place. The coaches noticed. I was slipping down the depth chart. I knew what I had to do. So one last time, I returned. He was waiting, standing at midfield like always. The wind howled, the stadium lights buzzed, but this time, there was something different in the air. "You came back," he said. I swallowed. "I want to make a deal." A slow grin spread across his face. "You already did." The lights flickered, the world blurred. And suddenly, I wasn't standing on the field anymore. I was watching from the stands, and someone else was wearing my jersey. I tried to move, tried to shout, but no sound came from my throat. My body felt frozen, locked in place. Down on the field, the player, my replacement, dropped back, wound up, and fired a perfect spiral. The phantom coach stood beside him, nodding in approval. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew it was too late. I was forgotten, and he had found someone new. Story number 5. Blood on the Turf. The Forgotten Super Bowl. The first time I heard about it, I thought it was a joke. Some urban legend passed around by old players with nothing better to do than scare rookies. Super Bowl 13, the game that was erased from history. I was in my third year as an analyst when I stumbled across it. My job was simple: dig up old footage for an NFL documentary. But when I came across a gap, an entire Super Bowl missing from the archives, I got curious. Every record, every article, every official statement said the same thing. Super Bowl 13 was played as expected. Steelers versus Cowboys, no issues. But the deeper I looked, the more I found little inconsistencies. Missing game tapes, conflicting eyewitness accounts, and most unsettling of all, a handful of former players who refused to speak about it at all. Then I found the tape. It was buried in the basement of an old media storage facility, stuffed inside an unmarked reel canister. The label was handwritten, faded, SB13, do not view. My hands were sweating when I loaded it into the old projector. The footage flickered to life, black and white, grainy, but clear enough to see the packed stadium, the roaring fans. Everything looked normal at first. Then I noticed something wrong. The scoreboard wasn't right. The names weren't teams I recognized. And the date at the bottom, February 4th, 1979, wasn't the official date of Super Bowl 13. I turned up the volume. The announcers sounded off. Their voices were strained, urgent. "We have a developing situation on the field," one of them muttered. The camera panned to the 50-yard line, where players from both teams were frozen in place, not celebrating, not moving, just standing, their helmets tilted slightly, as if they were listening to something. And then, all at once, they dropped. Not like tackles, like puppets with their strings cut. The crowd noise cut out completely. The only sound was the crackling of the old film reel. The camera zoomed in on one of the fallen players. His body twitched. His fingers clawed at the turf like he was trying to grip something that wasn't there. And then, slowly, his head turned right toward the camera. I don't know how to describe what I saw. His eyes were gone. Not just blackened, not just closed, gone. The sockets gaped empty, hollow, like something had scooped them out. Blood pooled under him, soaking the turf in a way that looked wrong, too dark, too thick. The footage shook violently. The camera operators must have been running, because the angle spun wildly. Coaches, referees, even fans in the stands, all of them collapsed, their bodies convulsing. The scoreboard flickered, the numbers shifting into something unreadable. And just before the film cut out completely, a voice whispered through the static. It was never supposed to be seen. I yanked the reel out of the projector, my breathing ragged. My entire body felt ice cold. This had to be fake, right? Some kind of hoax, but then why was the footage hidden? Why did every record erase this game from history? I spent the next few weeks tracking down anyone who might have been there. Most hung up immediately. A few muttered that they didn't remember, but their voices trembled. One man, a retired equipment manager, listened in silence as I described what I saw. When I finished, there was a long pause before he whispered, "Burn the tape." I asked him why. He just hung up. That night, I dreamed about the footage, the empty-eyed player staring at me, the way his lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. When I woke up, my TV was on, static filling the screen. My chest felt tight, like someone was pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I decided to destroy the tape. Whatever it was, whatever had happened that night, I didn't want to be part of it anymore. I drove out to an empty field, poured gasoline over the reel, and lit a match. The flames swallowed it fast, but just as the last of the film curled and blackened, I heard it. That same whisper from the footage. It was never supposed to be seen. I spun around, my pulse hammering. No one was there, just the wind howling through the empty field. I left that night. I quit my job. I moved across the country. I deleted every file, every note I had about Super Bowl 13. But sometimes, when I'm watching a game, I'll see something in the background. A shadow that moves too fast. A flicker on the scoreboard that disappears before anyone notices. I try to ignore it. I tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But I know better. Some games should never be remembered. Story number 6. The Stadium That Eats People, 2020. I didn't believe the stories at first. An abandoned stadium swallowing people whole. It sounded like some internet creepypasta, the kind of thing people made up to get clicks. But then my brother disappeared. It was December 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. My brother Leo was a construction worker hired to help tear down the old Mercer Stadium in Ohio. The place had been empty for years, closed after a sinkhole had opened up in the west end zone. No teams played there anymore, no fans, just a decaying relic of what used to be Friday night lights and roaring crowds. Leo and I talked almost every day, but one evening he stopped replying. No calls, no messages. I assumed he was just busy. Then his foreman called me asking if I had seen him. Leo had clocked in that morning, gone into the stadium with the crew, but when they did roll call at the end of the shift, he was gone. His truck was still in the lot, his tools left in the locker. No one saw him leave. He just vanished. I drove to the stadium that night. The place was surrounded by chain link fences, warning signs plastered everywhere. Danger, unsafe structure, do not enter. That didn't stop me. I slipped through a gap in the fence and stepped onto the field. The air felt wrong, heavy, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The stadium was massive, towering over me like a sleeping beast. The floodlights, though broken, seemed to loom as if they could flicker on at any second. I called Leo's name. My voice echoed through the stands. Nothing, just the hollow wind and the distant rustle of something moving where no one should be. Then I saw it. His hard hat, lying near the collapsed west end zone. I ran to it, my breath coming in sharp bursts. The ground felt soft, almost alive beneath my feet. I crouched down, picking up the hat. The inside was warm, like someone had just worn it. But the dirt around it was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks. It was like he had been lifted off the ground. I took a step back and the earth beneath me groaned. Something shifted. The ground moved, not like an earthquake, not like the unstable foundation the city claimed had shut this place down. It was more like breathing. Slow, deliberate inhale. And then the sound started. It came from deep inside the tunnels beneath the stadium, a low, guttural noise like metal scraping against bone. I wanted to believe it was just wind, just the old pipes groaning. But then I heard something else, whispers, dozens of them, too low to make out the words, but enough to send ice down my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned to run, but the entrance I had come through was gone. The tunnel I had walked past before was now just concrete wall. My pulse pounded in my ears. I scrambled toward the nearest exit, but the more I moved, the more the stadium seemed to shift. Bleachers stretched higher. Hallways lengthened. Doors that had been open were now sealed shut. It was changing, rearranging. I was in its belly now. I ran down a hallway, my phone flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Every shadow, felt like it was reaching for me. My breathing was ragged. Then I saw it, a staircase leading up to the announcer's booth. I bolted for it, taking the steps 2 at a time. If I could get high enough, maybe I'd see a way out. I reached the booth and slammed the door behind me. The window overlooked the entire field, a view meant for play-by-play calls and halftime shows. But the field wasn't empty anymore. I saw figures, dozens of them standing in the middle of the turf. Their bodies were twisted, elongated, like something had stretched them too far. Their heads lolled at unnatural angles. Jerseys, construction uniforms, referee stripes, different eras, different times. Their faces were gone. My stomach twisted. I recognized some of them. Old players from the stadium's glory days. Their photographs still hanging in the halls. The foreman who had called me about Leo. And in the center of them all, Leo. He stood unmoving, his eyes hollow pits of darkness, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then as one, all of them turned to look at me. The press box trembled, the walls groaned, the glass cracked. I stumbled backward as the floor beneath me caved in, sending me plummeting through darkness. I landed hard. The wind knocked from my lungs. Dirt filled my mouth. The air was thick, suffocating. I tried to push myself up, but something wrapped around my ankle. Hands, cold, clammy hands shot up from the ground, grasping, clawing. I kicked, screamed, fought. They pulled me deeper. My nails scraped against the floor. But there was no solid ground anymore, only endless, hungry earth. Then I saw it, not a sinkhole, not an unstable foundation, a mouth. The ground itself split open, lined with jagged rows of something that wasn't quite teeth. And beneath it, endless darkness, pulsing like a living thing. It wasn't a stadium anymore. It was feeding. I did the only thing I could. I reached for my pocket knife and slashed at the hands gripping me. The moment the blade touched them, they recoiled, shrieking. I scrambled upward, clawing my way to the surface. The tunnel twisted around me, but I kept going, dragging myself forward until I hit something solid, concrete, the locker room. I gasped for air and stumbled forward, half crawling, half running. The walls trembled behind me. The whispers rose into a wailing scream. The door to the field was right there. I didn't think. I threw myself at it, bursting out into the cold night. Silence. The stadium was still. The air normal. The field empty. Leo was gone. They were all gone. I don't remember leaving. I just remember getting in my car, driving until the sun came up. When I went back the next day with the police, Mercer Stadium was gone. Not just condemned, gone. The field was flat, undisturbed, like no stadium had ever been there at all. No record of it, no news of the demolition. Just an empty lot where something should have been, where something had been. Leo was never found. No missing persons reports, no mentions in the papers. It was like he had never existed. Like none of them had. I don't tell people about that night. I don't go near old stadiums. But sometimes, when I pass an empty field, I feel it. The pull, the hunger. And I know it's still out there, waiting for someone else to walk in. Story number 7. The quarterback who never left. It was supposed to be my big break, a chance to step onto the field as the new backup quarterback for the Denver Broncos. After years of grinding, I was finally here. But from the moment I arrived, I felt it. Something was off. The locker they assigned me had a nameplate that had been half scratched off. The equipment guy handed me my jersey, pausing for just a second before saying, "You got his number." I asked who, but he just shook his head and walked away. I should have let it go. Practice was brutal, as expected, but that wasn't what got to me. It was the field. The way the grass felt wrong under my cleats. Too soft in some places, like it wasn't fully solid. And the way the air smelled, not like turf and sweat, but something older, something stale. And then there were the whispers. It started small, and the first time I heard them, I thought it was just my imagination, a stray voice in the wind as I jogged to the huddle. But then I started hearing my name, not from my teammates, not from the coaches, from the empty stands. I told myself I was just tired. I kept my head down, focused on my game, but I couldn't ignore the way the team looked at me, the way some of them would glance at my jersey, then at each other, like they knew something I didn't. It all came to a head after one late-night practice. The starters had already left, and I was running extra reps, trying to get my timing right. The stadium was nearly empty, the floodlights casting long shadows. I was about to wrap up when I noticed someone standing near the tunnel. He was wearing a Broncos jersey. Number 14. My number. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was watching me, just standing there, arms crossed. I waved. He didn't move. Just as I was about to call out, my foot slipped. I hit the ground hard. The breath knocked from my lungs. By the time I looked up, he was gone. I laughed it off at first. Rookie nerves. Maybe a staff member messing with me. But when I walked into the locker room, my nameplate had been scratched off even more. Like someone didn't want me there. That night, I looked up the history of the team. I don't know what I was expecting, but when I found it, my skin went cold. A quarterback had worn my number before. Back in 1994, his name was Jamison Carter. He was a rising star set to take over as the franchise quarterback, but during a practice, he collapsed on the field. No cause of death, no pre-existing conditions. 1 second, he was fine. The next, gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing by the tunnel, wearing my jersey. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Numbers get recycled. It didn't mean anything. But then the dreams started. I was back on the field. The stadium was empty. Fog rolled across the turf, thick and heavy, and in the middle of it stood Jamison Carter. His jersey was torn, his skin pale, his eyes empty. But he wasn't staring at me, he was staring through me. He didn't speak, just pointed at the sky. I followed his gaze and saw the scoreboard flickering. The numbers changed, shifting wildly until they settled on 1994. I woke up, drenched in sweat. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling clung to me. At practice, my throws were off. My legs felt sluggish. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, like I was running through something invisible. Then, during a drill, I heard it, clear as day, a voice right behind me. "You don't belong here." I spun around. No one was there, but my teammates had stopped moving. They were staring at me like they'd seen a ghost. "You okay, man?" one of them asked. I nodded. I didn't tell them the truth. I didn't tell them that I had felt something brush past me, something ice cold. That night, I tried to quit. I told the coach I wasn't feeling well, that I needed some time. He just sighed and nodded. "Figured it'd happen. Never sticks." "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "You're the third guy we've given that locker to. The third, number 14. None of them lasted the season." I packed my bags. I was done. But before I could leave, I had to see it one last time. The field. I had to know if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I walked out under the empty stadium lights. The field was silent. Still. But as I turned toward the tunnel, my blood ran cold. Jamison Carter was standing at midfield. This time I saw him clearly. His face was sunken, his skin stretched too tight over his bones. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he lifted his arm and pointed at me. My chest seized. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't listen. My vision blurred, the lights flickering. The turf beneath me felt soft, too soft. I was sinking into the ground, into something cold, something deep. Then, just as suddenly, I was free. The stadium was empty again. Carter was gone, but something was different. I looked down at my jersey. The number was gone, just a blank space where it should have been. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the stadium, out of the city. I never played football again. A few months later, I checked the roster. They had reassigned number 14 to a new guy, rookie, eager, just like I had been. I don't know what happened to him. I don't want to know. Some quarterbacks never leave, and some of us never should have stepped onto the field at all. Story number 8, Huddle of the Damned. I had never played in a game like that before. No one had. It was a freak occurrence, they said. The fog rolled in too thick, too fast, swallowing the field, muting the roar of the crowd. The air was heavy, almost damp, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. By the time the third quarter ended, you could barely see the goalposts. But the refs didn't call it. They should have. God, they should have. I played linebacker, and that night, I was sharper than ever. Every tackle, every read, I was locked in. But something wasn't right. The fog had weight to it, like it was pressing down on us. The play clock on the scoreboard flickered. The crowd's cheers faded into a distant hum, like we were playing in a stadium buried underwater. Then it happened. Fourth quarter. Tie game. The other team had the ball. Midfield. They called a timeout, and as I jogged back to our huddle, I realized something was wrong. Our quarterback was staring past us, past the field, into the fog. His face was pale, lips slightly parted. He looked lost. "You good, man?" I asked. He blinked like he was waking up from a dream. He didn't answer. The play was called. We lined up. The snap came, and everything slowed. I charged forward, but my legs felt heavy, like I was running through water. The quarterback rolled out, looking for a receiver. The fog thickened. I lost sight of the wideouts of my teammates. The whole field shrank to just me and him. Then I saw the shadows. Not players, not people. Things. They stood along the sidelines, just out of reach of the stadium lights. Twisted figures, too tall, their limbs too long, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, watching, waiting. A whistle blew. The play was dead. I turned to my teammates, expecting someone else to have seen it, to say something. But they just stood there, silent, staring at me like I was the one acting strange. The next play, it got worse. The snap came, and the moment I moved, the fog swallowed everything. I couldn't see my hands in front of me. I stopped. Breath caught in my throat. The crowd was gone. The stadium was gone. And then, from the mist, figures emerged. But they weren't wearing the other team's jerseys. Their uniforms were old, leather helmets, faded numbers. Their faces were wrong. Hollow eyes, mouths too wide, twisted into expressions of rage and agony. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The nearest player, a massive lineman from another time, his jersey torn, his ribs visible beneath his shoulder pads, grabbed me by the face mask. You don't belong here." The words rattled inside my skull, not spoken, but forced into my mind. My knees buckled. I felt the weight of them all around me, a huddle of bodies pressing in, suffocating. The game hadn't stopped. It had just changed, and I wasn't supposed to be part of it. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The fog thinned, the field returned, the lights flickered back to full brightness. My teammates were running down the field, the crowd screaming. The play had continued without me. I stumbled to the sideline. No one said anything. No one asked where I had been, why I hadn't moved. I looked up at the scoreboard. The clock had frozen at 3:33. The game ended in a tie. Something that shouldn't have happened. It was sudden death over time. But the officials refused to restart play. They called it an error. We were sent to the locker rooms, told to forget it, move on. But I couldn't. That night, I looked up the history of the stadium. It had been rebuilt twice. The original structure burned down in 1949. An accident, they claimed. The second collapsed in 1973. Players had died. Coaches had died, and yet the games always continued. I don't know what I stepped into that night. I don't know why they let me leave. But I never played again. Because I know some huddles never break. Story number 9. The Whispering Locker Room, 1983. It started as a simple assignment. Covering the history of old stadiums wasn't exactly exciting journalism, but I took the job anyway. The story was supposed to be about the renovation of an old high school football stadium in Texas, a place that hadn't been used in decades. The school shut down in 1983 after a fire gutted half the building, and since then, the field and locker rooms had been abandoned. When I arrived, the structure was still standing barely. The air smelled like mildew and rust, the walls covered in graffiti. The stadium itself looked eerily intact, like the game had just ended, and everyone walked away. The grass was overgrown, but the goalposts were still there. The bleachers sat empty, holding only the weight of dust and time. I found the locker room entrance half buried in debris. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, stale sweat, damp wood, something else I couldn't place, the kind of scent that lingers long after people are gone. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of rusted lockers, peeling paint, and broken benches. Then I heard a whisper. I froze. The sound was faint, like wind slipping through a crack in the walls, but there was no wind. The air was dead still. I told myself it was nothing, just the sound of an old building settling. But as I took another step, I heard it again, clearer this time. Words I couldn't quite make out. I swept the light over the lockers. Nothing. My heart pounded. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. The construction crew wasn't coming until the morning. I had planned to get a few pictures, take some notes, and leave, but now something felt wrong. I stepped forward, and the whisper stopped. Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Then, just as I reached the last row of lockers, every single door slammed shut at once. The noise was deafening. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. My breath came in short gasps. The lockers stood still again, as if they had never moved. My gut told me to leave, but my hands acted on their own, reaching for one of the locker doors. It was rusted shut, but I yanked harder, the metal groaning as it gave way. Inside, something was waiting. A single football jersey, faded and torn, hung from a rusted hook. The number 12. Below it, a pair of cleats covered in dried mud. A smell drifted out, earthy, metallic, like old blood. I pulled back, my fingers trembling. That whisper came again, right next to my ear this time. He never left. I spun around. No one was there. My pulse pounded against my skull. I knew I needed to get out. but my body refused to move. I turned back to the locker, and my breath caught in my throat. The jersey was gone. The cleats were gone. The locker was empty. I stumbled backward, the whispers rising again, overlapping, growing frantic. They came from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from inside my own head. He never left. The door behind me slammed shut. My flashlight flickered. A shadow moved at the far end of the room, stepping out from the corner, where my light didn't reach. A boy. He was tall, wearing a vintage started football uniform. His helmet hung from his fingers, his cleats leaving damp footprints on the floor. His face was obscured by darkness, but I could feel his stare digging into me. I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. The boy tilted his head as if confused. Then he whispered something I barely caught. I didn't hear the whistle. My flashlight died. The room plunged into darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps. Then I heard footsteps rushing toward me, heavy, fast. I ran. I don't know how I reached the door, but when I burst outside, the air felt different. The night was too still, too quiet. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and when the engine roared to life, I floored it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my motel room, staring at my notes, at the pictures on my camera. And that's when I saw it. One of the photos I had taken of the locker room, before the whispers started, before the doors slammed. In the background, half hidden in the shadows, was the boy, watching me. The next morning I called the city records office, asking if they had any archives about the stadium's history. An old clerk hesitated before finally saying, "You should let it go." I didn't. I kept digging until I found it. October 1983. A player had died during a game. A safety named David Kellerman. He had gone for a tackle, took a bad hit, collapsed on the field. No foul play, no medical condition. The official report said the whistle blew, signaling the end of the play, but David never got up. The school held a vigil, then closed its doors 2 months later. I drove back to the stadium one last time just to see it in the daylight. The locker room door hung open, the air inside cold, stale. I stood at the entrance, listening, waiting. Nothing. Then, as I turned to leave, the wind picked up, faint at first, then stronger, and in that gust, I swore I heard it again. The whistle, long, sharp, calling the game dead. I never went back. Story number 10. The rookie's nightmare. I came into the league, ready to prove myself. A rookie tight end, fresh off a strong college season, drafted by New Orleans. I was hungry, desperate to make a name for myself. I thought I knew what pressure was. I thought I had faced fear before, but nothing prepared me for what happened in that locker room. The veterans had warned me about the initiation. Every rookie goes through it, they said. Nothing too bad, just part of earning your place. I expected pranks, maybe a little hazing, but the way they said it, the way they looked at me, almost nervous, made my skin crawl. The night before our first preseason game, I was the last one in the locker room. Most of the guys had already left. My hands trembled as I taped my wrists, nerves setting in. I had to make an impression tomorrow. I had to be ready. Then the lights flickered. At first I thought nothing of it. Old stadium, faulty wiring. But then the temperature dropped. Not just a chill, but something deeper, seeping into my bones. The hairs on my arms stood up. I turned toward the door, about to grab my bag, when I heard it. Footsteps, not from the hallway, not from outside, from inside the locker room. I turned fast, my breath caught in my throat. The room was empty, just rows of lockers, jerseys hanging neatly, equipment stacked for tomorrow, but the footsteps kept coming. Slow, deliberate. I forced a laugh. All right, guys. Funny. Real funny. Silence. Then a whisper. Low, almost gentle. You're not ready. I felt something move behind me. I spun around, fists clenched, but no one was there. The door leading to the showers creaked open on its own, the sound echoing through the empty room. My heart pounded. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves messing with me. I grabbed my bag and turned toward the exit. The door slammed shut. I dropped my bag. My pulse was hammering now, every instinct screaming for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My breath clouded in the freezing air. Then, one by one, the lockers began to rattle, soft at first, then violently, banging like someone trapped inside was trying to break free. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The whispers came again, closer this time. Not ready, not ready, not ready. My foot hit something, a helmet. I bent down, picking it up. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even from this season. The logo was old, the padding worn, the number etched on the back, scratched and faded. I turned it over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. Dried blood along the inside. A sharp, guttural breath sounded inches from my ear. A voice rasped, "You took my place." I dropped the helmet and bolted for the door, slamming my fists against it. It wouldn't budge. My own reflection stared back at me in the small glass window. Wide eyes, face pale with terror. Then, slowly, another face appeared beside mine. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, a twisted mouth stretching into something between a snarl and a grin. I screamed and stumbled back. The figure moved closer, stepping fully into the dim light. He wore a Saints jersey, but it was old, decades out of date. The number on it was 87, my number. The air grew thick, heavy. He stared at me, eyes filled with something worse than anger. Regret. He took another step, and I saw his leg, twisted, bent at an impossible angle, like it had been snapped in half. A jagged bone pushed through the fabric. He limped forward, his head tilting. You don't deserve that ball. I pressed against the lockers, my chest heaving. Who are you? My voice barely worked. He let out a hollow chuckle. You already know. And I did. I had seen his face before, long ago in old team photos. The forgotten rookie. The player who never got his shot because of a freak accident in practice. He had shattered his leg beyond repair. Never played again. Never made it past his first game. The air pressed against me like a weight suffocating. He took another step forward, his foot dragging unnaturally. I was trapped. Nowhere to run. Then I remembered the helmet. I grabbed it and swung as hard as I could. The moment it connected, the locker room exploded into chaos. The lights blew out. The lockers slammed open and shut. The whispers turned into full-throated screams. The walls shook, and then silence. I gasped for air. The room was normal again. No figure, no blood. Just me, standing there, shaking, gripping a helmet that didn't exist anymore. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember getting to my car. But I do remember the next morning. When I walked into the locker room, my teammates were laughing, joking around like nothing had happened. But as I reached my locker, I froze. Sitting on the bench was a jersey. My jersey, number 87. Only This one was old, faded, and across the back, where my name should have been, was his. I never told anyone. I never wore that number again. Some rookies never make it, and some don't leave at all. Story number 11. The Cursed Playbook. Coaching was supposed to be my calling. I had spent years climbing through the ranks, grinding in small college programs, waiting for my shot. When I finally got hired as the offensive coordinator for a struggling pro team, it felt like my break had come. The team was a mess, barely scraping together a few wins each season. But I knew I could turn things around, or at least I thought I could. The playbook arrived in an unmarked box. That should have been the first sign that something was off. The team's head coach had been let go suddenly, mid-season, and everything had been rushed. I assumed it was just old notes, leftover material from a past era. When I opened it, though, I realized this was different. The pages were yellowed, the edges frayed. The diagrams were unlike anything I had ever seen. Formations that made no logical sense, routes that doubled back on themselves. Some of the handwriting looked rushed, almost manic. Plays with strange names. Ghost Route, Reaper Sweep, The Dead Man's Audible. I should have thrown it away, but we were desperate. We had lost 5 straight games. The players were exhausted. Morale was dead, and I needed something, anything, to shake things up. So I studied the plays. I broke them down, tried to understand the strategy behind them. And the strangest part? They worked. The first time I called Ghost Route, our wide receiver found himself wide open with no defender in sight. He walked into the end zone, untouched. The next drive, we ran Reaper Sweep, and our running back cut through the defense like they weren't even there. It was like the other team didn't know how to react, like they couldn't see what we were doing. We won that game, and the next, and the next. The press started calling it a miracle turnaround. No one questioned it. No one asked where these plays had come from. The players didn't care. The owners were thrilled, but I started noticing things. The quarterback was the first one. After our 4th straight win, I found him sitting in the locker room long after everyone had left, staring at the floor. I asked him what was wrong, and he just shook his head. When I run the plays, he said, it's like I hear something, like someone's whispering the call before I say it. I laughed it off, told him it was just nerves. But then it happened again. One of our linemen went down during practice. No contact, just collapsed. When we checked the film, there was no explanation. He had lined up, gotten into position, and then his knee buckled, like something had taken him down. He was out for the season. I should have stopped, but we were winning. For the first time in my career, I felt like I had control, so I ignored the signs. I kept calling the plays. Then came the game against our biggest rival. 4th quarter, tie game. We had the ball, final drive. I reached for the playbook, flipping through the pages, my hands shaking. My fingers landed on a play I didn't remember seeing before. The Dead Man's Audible. The ink looked fresh, like it had been added recently. My gut twisted. Every instinct told me not to call it, but my mind, something in my mind told me I had to. My headset crackled. I thought I heard a voice, low and cold. Call it. I did. The moment the quarterback barked the audible, everything changed. The stadium lights dimmed for half a second, just enough to make the crowd murmur. The air turned heavy, thick, like a storm was coming. The ball was snapped. And then Chaos. Our quarterback stepped back, but something was wrong. He wasn't moving right. His feet dragged like he was being held. The linemen didn't react, frozen in place. The wide receivers took off, but they weren't running the routes we had practiced. It was like they weren't in control anymore. Then the screaming started. One of our players collapsed, clutching his chest. Another grabbed his helmet like he was trying to rip it off. The ball was still in play, bouncing across the turf as the quarterback dropped to his knees, gasping for air. The other team didn't react. They stood there, staring, like they weren't seeing what we were seeing. The clock hit 0. The game was over. We had lost. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the way my players lay sprawled across the field, like something had drained the life from them. I never called a play from that book again. After that night, I tried to get rid of it. I left it in my office, but every morning, it was back on my desk. I locked it in a cabinet, but somehow, it always found its way out. One night, I drove to a river outside town and threw it in. I watched it sink, bubbles rising to the surface. The next morning, it was waiting for me in the locker room. I quit coaching after that season. I walked away from everything, moved across the country. I never spoke to anyone from that team again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. A whisper calling the next play. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more terrifying tales. And if you've ever had a horror experience of your own, share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story. Also, check out the videos appearing on the screen now for more chilling content. Thanks for watching, and stay safe, if you can.